you can see the web of knowledge branch out where you're just like, wow, my idea of learning was that you sat in a class or you took a course, and that's hilarious.
Hi, welcome to another episode of Learning by Living, the podcast about people who learn or work outside of conventional schools. If you're familiar with unschooling, our guest today probably needs no introduction, but here's one anyway. Akilah Richards hosts a widely celebrated podcast, Fare of the Free Child, with more than 150 episodes on self-directed education among Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. She's also a public speaker who writes for numerous outlets, including Mater Mea, Mother Magazine, and Tipping Points Magazine. The author of the forthcoming book, Raising Free People, she and her partner Chris are raising two self-directed daughters, Marley and Sage. Today, Gina, Akilah, and I talked about what unschooling looks like in their family, the importance of unschooling for people of color, how they went from conventional schooling all the way to unschooling, and a whole lot more. Akilah was an incredible person to talk to, and we really hope you enjoy our conversation with her.
Hi, you guys. Hi, Akilah. Welcome.
Hey, Akilah.
Hey, Gina, Kevin. Thanks for having me on.
So I have to say, you are one of my favorite people within the self-directed education movement. So I'm going to just fangirl all over you like I told you before. I think you're the person doing the most work regarding social justice and equity issues within the movement. I think you're doing the most work within people of color within the movement. And I'm so honored to have you here as a guest.
I really appreciate it. It's good because I think the visibility, we are in kind of concentric circles, and with like Peter Gray, as someone that both you and I partner with, and also Kevin through the Alliance, and Tipping Points. Kevin and I have worked together through the online magazine for the Alliance as well. And I think that my visibility in some of those circles could definitely give one the impression that I'm doing the most work. But I also think that a big part of why I love doing things like this, getting together and talking with you and being able to connect with some of your audiences, is to show folks that actually there's so many of us doing this type of work, and people who've been doing this for so many years, people who've been doing this in one specific city with very clear results, so I love being able to amplify that too through the work that I do as well,
So Akilah, big question for you. Who is Akilah Richards, and how did your family discover unschooling and self-directed learning? Because if I'm not mistaken, your daughter Marley was in a conventional school for some time, and you as a family chose a different path. So how did that happen?
So both of my daughters, Marley and Sage, were in public elementary school for 2.5 and about a year, respectively. What happened was, I don't know, we kind of went through the typical grow up, or the conventional, I should say, grow up, get married, have the babies, try to find the best neighborhood to raise the babies, and then put them in the school in that neighborhood. That's what we did, Chris and me. And then Marley, she was doing really well in terms of academically. I mean, it sounds crazy now for me to talk about academically in like kindergarten and freaking first and second grade, right? But that's where my mind was. I wanted my kid to be excellent because that's what you did, or that's what we did. And so she got labeled gifted and talented, and then they created a curriculum that worked for Marley that included some gifted classes, and then bringing in a middle school teacher to do her language arts. And they really created something that made sense for where they thought her learning was across subjects. And while that was happening, emotionally, she was like withering. She used to be this really vibrant kid who was really excited about asking questions and telling you what she discovered today, and what she loved about it and what she didn't love about it. And she went from being that way to being really nervous about whether it was okay to ask a question or the right type of question, or whether she would have enough time to think about how she wanted to answer your question. She just was different. And then she kept saying, there was this cartoon series, it's called Fetch with Rough Ruffman. I don't know, some parents out there listening remember that series. And Marley loved that series. It was a dog who was also a detective. And she loved that series. And she would watch it in the evening and spend like the whole rest of that evening and maybe even the next morning kind of talking out loud about the scenario and what she thought was weird and which parts were inconsistent and which parts made sense. And she would say that going to school would get in the way of that she wanted to focus on that. But then people were giving her other things to do that she had to perform, and she could perform them, but could she only do it maybe like 2 days a week? Or, like she was really like trying to work with us about how she spent her time. And we're like, child, relax. No, you stay in the classroom, you do these things, and you're awesome at it. And you watch Fetch from 4 to 4:30, and then we get back to homework. And so that happened, that push and pull happened enough times that Chris and I started to, I don't know, just kind of check in with like, should we continue to silence that? Like, is that cool? Like in terms of like human to human, it feels shitty. Like, is that, oh no. And then when Sage started school, a similar thing happened, but for different reasons. Sage, it was more so personality. She's a comfortable introvert. She's not shy. She's introverted. And so she likes to be alone, even when we're at home. One of her first sets of words to her sister is personal space, Mar. She calls her Mar. Personal space, Mar. She liked to be alone and get the toys that she wanted and go over into a certain corner of the house. And she didn't need anything. And if she did, she'd come let us know. And so school for her was really, it just felt like she called it peopling. They keep peopling on me. She just felt really uncomfortable. And so over time, Chris and I decided that what the girls kept pushing for was relevant and worth looking into. And ultimately, they didn't want to be in school. And so we said, okay, let's try that. And that's how we stopped schooling and thought that we would go over into homeschooling. And we did for a little bit, like less than a year. And then we transitioned into just being with them and observing the ways that learning was happening all the time. And it was just Chris and me who didn't understand it. And that our ideas of learning were really based on like performing learning, which is not the same. So, and then over time I was like, oh, I discovered that there was this thing called unschooling discovered, and that other people were having similar experiences with their families. And that, so that's kind of how we got to that space. We became location independent as a result of that, because it's like our whole lives were centered around school. And when it wasn't anymore, we realized that we could live somewhere else or we could visit somewhere else. And then visits went from a few weeks to like a few months to like a year. And it just opened up how we live now.
And we hear that story a lot too. People will take their children out of school and have the idea of homeschooling. We'll replicate school at home with a curriculum. And I'm not sure if that's kind of what you did. And then you start to realize that they just learn more outside of that. What was that transition like? Like, how did you come to realize that they were just learning more without a formal curriculum?
Language acquisition. Marley and Sage began to learn languages that certainly I wasn't teaching them. Chris wasn't teaching them. He and I both speak little bits of Spanish, having grown up in South Florida. And we would use terms like, like the few terms that we knew, like when they were little. So, but outside of that, we didn't know any other languages. But they, as a result of their interest in, for example, anime, started learning Japanese and then started learning Mandarin.
Wow.
And then went into really specific, interesting things like Finno-Ugric languages. Like, I don't even remember which ones those are, but I remember Sage was studying those for some time. And then she would say things like, oh, if you know Polish, you'll know these two languages at a basic level, because the original, as a result of Japanese cartoons and then costume design, and then studying the culture of the place that costume came from, like, that's what did it for us. The person, I was like, what the hell?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, what else don't we know?
Yeah.
And when you say they were studying them, do you have any idea of where they were getting them? Like, I know from anime and other things, but then when they're studying them, are they finding things online? Where are they going?
Online. So anime was also a form of study. So as in, they would dedicate lots of time to taking in chunks of that information and then discussing it with each other, going online in groups that talked about specific anime, which they still do. Years later, it's been like 9 years. They still are in groups that will dissect one specific series, from the origin to how true it is to the book that it's based on, to the history and culture of those actual people, the historical accuracy of the characters, the character design, the costume design, the languages that it was translated from, and what might have been lost, and what would happen if you created one in that language, and who's going to do it. That level of freaking detail. So, and then they use apps like Hello Talk, for example, to communicate with people who want to learn the languages that they already know, like English, or in like the case of my daughters, like Japanese and Mandarin. In some Welsh, I think, so mainly online. And then because we travel sometimes in cities, like we'll look up at local libraries, we'll have meetup groups for specific anime and manga, and they'll meet up sometimes with those groups and stay connected to people, in their own language, because communicating in original language is something that they deeply value as creatives and as people who are fans of creatives. Because that's why Marley learned Japanese, for example, because she found out that one of her favorite animes was being translated by a native English speaker, not a native Japanese speaker, when she was like 12. And she was like, what? I can't watch this. I don't even know what if that's not what they meant? And that was why she learned Japanese.
Wow. And does she know fairly fluent Japanese?
Yeah, she does. And I have a Japanese friend who, when I was still doubtful, it was like on WhatsApp, I was like, Marley, say some shit, and then I'm going to send it to my friend. And I sent it to Michael, and Michael was like, not only is that great, like her accent is impressive, Akilah. Like she just broke down any doubts that I had. And I've also seen her, and also Sage with Mandarin, seen them communicate with people now enough times to be like, totally, it's not like me with Spanish where I can just say like a few things. And that's pretty normal also in unschooling circles. I do want to point that out there. That happens all the time, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think the language learning is something we see like a lot. I remember when interviewed Carrie McDonald, she talked about her daughter learning Korean. You're talking about Japanese and Polish. And I mean, it can't be just a trend, like you and I both know that so many unschoolers do experience that. So could we shift to learning reading and learning math and things like that, and how that occurs within an unschooling environment in your particular experience?
Yeah, so my experience at this point in my journey would be inclusive of both my children, and also because I've spoken to so many people about their experiences as well. And I love to be able to, bring both of those to the space. So for my family, the girls we weren't an unschooling family. The girls weren't having that freedom when they were learning how to read. So I was still very much of the schoolish mind, and in my mind, they needed to learn how to read and write before they even went to like pre-K or daycare, because of my own like fears of anything that could, you know, happen, that they wouldn't be able to communicate and all of that. Mm-hmm. So Marley was like, I don't know, 4 maybe. And I think Sage was about the same. And I was deliberate in teaching them to read and write. But I'm also aware of so many families like Zakia Ismail, a South African unschooling family whose children are now, I think maybe 20, 18, and 14 or 13. And none of them have ever been to school, and they all learn to read through like games, you know, like, and Tamika Middleton, who's based here in Atlanta, her children have never been to school. And it was because her son was frustrated with her having to sit there while he was playing his games, you know, reading the directions and all of that. And she just saw over a short time that he went from, Mom, can you slow down, to just like saying the words with her, to saying, can you just sit here and can I just ask you when I don't know a word, to, I don't need you here anymore, thanks, bye. You know, like in the course of like a few weeks. Yeah. Those are some of the ways that it comes up. And then also wanting to learning how to recognize that the focus on things like reading and math over time, having learned that sooner, there really is no proof that that makes you like smarter or better equipped in life. For example, like learning how to read at 3 versus 12, there's no correlation between either of those and like your level of success in life.
I think especially in this day and age where there's so many alternative mechanisms for conveying information other than reading. There's text to speech and all that stuff. So as more of that goes on, it seems like the emphasis on reading as the only way to get information is probably misplaced.
Yeah, and I would take that probably right. I snatched that probably right out of that sentence, Kevin. It's totally misplaced.
I know when we talk to unschooling folks, you hear a lot of stories about people learning things very quickly. So you find something you're really interested in, and you're so interested in it that you just devour it really fast in a way that you might not devour it as fast in school. And I'm wondering if you have any experience with that, if that rings true with your children's educational experiences.
Yeah, I mean, so language is definitely one. And really, everything that I've seen with Marley and Sage, that's how I use the word voracious. You know, like they just like glom onto a thing, and it's just like they partner with it. And they sleep it. For example, with Sage, one of her frustrations with going to school is that she didn't have enough time for her art. She's she's an artist, and so one of the things she loved to do was shade eyes. You know, like sketch out an eye and then do the different types of shading of an eye and parts of an eye, and then it went on to hair and, you know, like details of different types of hair and how hair would fall for different types of people. And she would do that if you gave her the space, or when she had the space, like on the weekends and in the evenings, she would spend hours. And so as a result of that, she got from, you know, what it would look like if I tried to do it to something where you were like, yo, this looks like someone's real freaking eye.
Wow.
You know, like in such
that
a
level
short,
of detail. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And then studying that. And so as a result of that, then in terms of like biology, she knows a lot about like not only the eye, the human eye, but like diseases, eye diseases, and how different types of eye diseases change how an eye looks and where those diseases originated, and you know, what people did to try to cure those things, from the absurd things to cutting it out, to how they found out that these particular plants as salves on the eye. So that's how they end up finding out like so much about so much from one single freaking thing.
Wow.
That's incredible. I think that's the best.
Yeah.
Right? There's the time and space to do that, to learn
Yes.
so much about that one freaking thing, right? Like, that's incredible.
Absolutely.
It's funny because I had in my head another question to ask you, which I like to ask folks is, what are some things your kids have learned that skeptics would be surprised they would learn outside of school? And you just hit on one as I was thinking of the question. It's like all these things about the biology of the eye and eye diseases and things like that.
Yeah. And I love that question too, Kevin, because it's something that I'm personally interested in, like the ways that they learn so many things. So for example, weapons, right? Like Sage in particular, who's now 13, knows a lot about weapons as a result of her interest in costume design. And when you study the design of anything, and when you study weaponry is connected to war, or costume design, because whatever protection they had is in a sense a costume. And so they know so much. Sage and Marley know so many historical things about, like, and I mean, I went to all the school, and the things that they know about, like, history and foods connected to that, like what foods came over as a result of like rations that came from which wars and which people traveled where and brought what over. They know historically so much about so many continents and countries that I think it's laughable that I, went to school and college and couldn't tell you not only a quarter of that, I couldn't even verify what they're saying. And where every time I look and verify, I'm so impressed because they know these things, and they know that, different mental disorders as a result of their studies in history, because people use certain weapons were also surgical tools or derivatives of surgical tools. And so you can see the web of knowledge branch out where you're just like, wow, my idea of learning was that you sat in a class or you took a course, and that's hilarious.
Yeah. So true. I love one of my favorite things that you do, and I don't know you even know you do it, but maybe you do, is that you call your daughters artists and creatives, right? They're not just your daughters, but they're artists and creatives. And I think that's so different from when you come from a traditional background, traditional school, and your kids are your kids. And here we're sitting here talking about art and creatives when talking about your daughters. And it's really quite a beautiful thing, but also a true thing, right? So it's not like you're saying it as a compliment, you're saying it as identity thing and defining who they are as people.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. It's it is deliberate, and I never thought about it in the context that you put it either. So I guess it's both, because that's exactly what they are. And so much of my work as a parent is to really learn to partner with Marley and Sage as people, not as students, not as my daughters, so I say all the time that even though they are mine, they own themselves, and it's important. Language is an important part of how I practice honoring the reality that they own themselves.
I love that so much. I do want to talk about your work with people of color and Black and brown people. My work is in New York City public schools. And a lot of the parents that I work with, people of color, Black and brown parents, white parents, we'll talk about distrust in public education spaces and public schools, but yet not know what to do with that distrust. Do you work with people with those same issues? And how do you bring out a more free way of living?
So to me, this isn't switching at all, because everything we've been talking about is exactly this. The fact that I can raise two Black girls who feel free to study anime and manga and language and history in a world that tells them specifically who they should be and who they aren't is all one and the same. And so I do, so many people, I should say, in my circles come from the spaces, myself included, where we are, that we know, we're clear that systemically things aren't made with us in mind. And when we are in mind, it's about our subjugation, certainly not our empowerment. When you look at curricula across platforms, across countries, you see Black, Indigenous, and people of color language, history, contribution being omitted or skewed, across those spaces. It is deliberate and intentional and ubiquitous. And it is also indicative of all the many other ways outside of schooling where our existence and contribution feels like a threat. And so to raise your children to be free to explore themselves and to have what I call confident autonomy is something that most people that I know, particularly Black, Indigenous, and people of color, are working towards always in our own way. And so that freedom, when you talk about how do we raise people, or the idea of a freer mind, it looks like different things for different ones of us. For some people, that freedom, that liberation work exists inside of the school system, to say that my child will be in the system and I will make myself available, which is what Chris and I used to do. I was on the PTA board, and I was the chair of the cultural committee to make sure that it wasn't just some white person every single time they brought in someone from for cultural whatever day or week or month, or the same one Spanish guy. So for some people, the work is done in those ways. And that is absolutely what liberation work looks like for the stage and the journey they are in. And then there's the side where I fit and work. I do not believe in reform. I'm not interested in what is happening with the system. I'm interested in the people inside of it, including the teachers, including students, including the people who head these schools. And what I want to do is be part of building something that when they get out, there are things in place, there's language and practice and community for us to operate outside of what the system has caused and cost us. And that's what I see self-directed education as a conduit for in my work and in my world. The idea that your child no longer needs to fit into this Eurocentric idea of what learning is and what achievement means is the first step towards what liberation might look like. And then as they become free and you become free of that hold, that stronghold, you go from seeing them as a fourth grader to a person, and then now you're living with a person and communicating to a person. What does that mean now for what learning looks like? How do you need to function differently in order to support learning that isn't coercive? That's what I'm about, and that's what liberation work looks like in this circle.
There was an interview that I saw I think you did last year. It might have been, I think, with a Canadian outlet. And you had said something about, very similar to what you said here, about how the schools that your daughters were in, and particularly Marley, I think you used as an example, were kind of infused with what you called whiteness. And I forget what the term you used was, but you wanted her to be able to not ignore, but bypass whiteness. I don't know if that was the word you used. And in my experience, talking to people about that article, a lot of folks probably what I think misunderstand what you mean in a very almost antagonistic way. And it seems like what you mean is more just that there's a cultural assumption that there are certain ideas that should just be taught because they're kind of the proper, polite ideas. There's a certain dialect of English that we teach in school as standard English. And and the history of that is just replete with marginalization of other dialects that were kind of squashed. And could you explain kind of what you mean by that whiteness that you wanted your daughters to not have to kind of go through in a compulsory sort of way?
Sure. So it's to center whiteness is really what what I mean and what I focus on. because what you said, Kevin, like whiteness, the everything from the dialect to the way we show up, to how our hair should look as people who are not white, to, you know, the way we should sound, to what it means to have on a suit. All of those things come from very specific white-centric ideas, a very colonized idea of what it means to show up and be proper and presentable and trustworthy, because all of those things are connected. And that's how people's humanity and safety get tied in, because it is about, do I trust you? Are you safe? And the more like whatever the popular culture says or dominant culture says, which is whiteness, the further you are away from that, the less safe you are. And so therefore your humanity can be compromised with less question. That's kind of the trajectory of that. And so when I talk about decentering whiteness, that it means that my children are free, and that all children are free, even when they are not white, to be themselves, to be in an environment where everything from, you know, we see in the news where children are being kicked out of school because of their afro or their braids, so that literal laws are now being put in place for people to be able to wear their hair the way that it grows out of their head, because that's what it's needing to take for someone to be safe to do that. From that to them being able to speak how they speak without someone saying they're not sure about their level of intelligence because of a Southern drawl. But if it's a Southern twang, then it's different. You know, so like all of these things that start to affect how you see yourself and whether or not you internalize a perspective of who you should be, or whether you recognize it as one of many social issues, which my children do. And many children who are in unschooling environments get to recognize these things as not an issue with Kevin or Gina, but an issue with pervasive whiteness, a mentality, a mindset, an institution that does have this one standardized idea. And that when you recognize that, it means that in relationship with people, you have a different sort of understanding and accountability and grace, if you want, about how to communicate, because you know that you're not hiding behind that. You're not seeing color. You're saying this exists. So now, you know, I'm not centering it and conforming to it, but it exists. So let's talk about how we can be ourselves together, you know?
It seems like, because to me, it seems like schools, whether deliberately or not only teach things, but they teach value judgments behind things. So they teach certain things in official history. And then when you get to, let's say, the Black Civil Rights Movement, that's Black history or African American history, which is separate in some ways. And then James Baldwin, who I consider probably the great American author, is a Black American author or an African American author. And, you know, a white author maybe just kind of a great American author. And it seems like unschooling gives you the freedom to kind of shed some of those value judgments. You can read Baldwin, you can read Melville, you can read Shakespeare, you can read Ellison, you can read Douglass, and there's no message about these are the right authors to read.
And you could not read anybody and not be able to quote anybody and have that be okay as well.
Sure.
All of that. Yes. And so these are the ways that it becomes and is liberation work, because and I'll speak for myself as a Black person, as a person who migrated from Jamaica to the US, you know, very specific ideas of what it meant to like obtain the American dream, and to de-school from that, to move away from what I'd been taught and told and what was valid and the only path that could be okay, to move away from that, to discover myself, and as a result of that, have the space to eventually give my daughters the room to discover themselves, and now do work where people work in community to support and maintain that sense and that right for self-discovery. all of those things are connected. And that's why I see unschooling as liberation work, particularly for people who have all these many layers before they can even get to be like free to learn.
So I think I want to talk about like both the business side of the work and then also your personal experience within the self-directed learning movement. So let's talk first about the Raising Free People Network and how you got that started and what that's all about for people who don't know.
Yeah. So much. I'm such an unschooler. Like if there was just how I understand unschooling, because I get to everything just really from curiosity and discovery and emergent structure. And my business is very much that, because Raising Free People Network is something that came as a result of me deciding to focus on unschooling as our primary way, ours and my family, our primary way of working with liberation, like what it means to be free or what it means to stop other people, i.e. children, from being free. And how, as you start to recognize that in one relationship, the relationship with a child, then it's kind of hard not to notice that in other types of relationships as well, and see how you play a role in that or how things affect you. And so Raising Free People became kind of like my chant for the work that I was doing with my daughters and with myself in terms of personal leadership, and also the types of communities that I was seeing around me, like agile learning centers and, like homeschooling collectives that really allowed people to do exactly whatever made sense for their families, as opposed to fitting into a particular box, because an agile learning center might feel like too much of a box for one set of families. And so the network is my way of expanding beyond my podcast, which amplifies the voices of people doing that in different ways, but now offering people space to do that themselves, like through their own podcast series or through even ads about things that they offer in community on one of my podcasts, or and also getting together physically, in person, locally, to understand how to champion self-directed education in ways that make sense for your community, with confidence and with a feeling of support. And so that's what the network is. And it just resulted from me needing that and seeing how that was being done in other places and wanting to put that together.
So is Marley still podcasting? Because I think she was podcasting for a bit, wasn't
She was for a little bit, but now only sometimes on my podcast, Unfair of the Free Child. But she was doing, and we've been talking about what self-expression online in terms of content might look like this coming year. And I know she's going to be starting a blog because she's been doing a lot more dance and wanting to get into choreography and like dissecting things in dance culture. So I know she's going to be writing like on a blog, but I'm not sure whether she'll be podcasting.
That's great. That's great. Have your daughters decided at any point that they want formal instruction in something and kind of gone in a more structured approach and sought out a structured way of instruction? Or are they pretty happy kind of?
Yeah, over and over.
Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Like what?
They do both. So for example, Japanese, like when Marley was learning, at one point she emailed me a form to fill out because she found a tutor on Skype who was going to take her through this curriculum to learn, is it katakana, like a particular type of Japanese in writing. And so I had to like fill out that form. And so there's that. And then they also take classes online for some things, like with painting, like Sage with art, or they'll go to a class for like dance or something like that. Also, we spent a whole year at an agile learning center because they wanted to be in a sort of unschoolish, schoolish environment. where they got up at a certain time, like they wanted to see if they could do that for a year. So we did that. Yeah, so those sort of things, they just kind of take them when they need them. And I think both of them are almost always in some sort of online class for something.
Yeah, because it's easy to imagine people who aren't in conventional schools kind of just doing it alone and, seeking out resources here and there without any formal structure. But it's often the case that people, when left to learn on their own, find value in formal structures, but they seek them out.
Exactly. That's exactly it. And also they especially for Marley, she loves the collaborative element. That's less important to Sage. So for Marley, she'll always be doing. So for example, when I'm going to be, because usually we live somewhere based on me getting like a gig in that city. So for example, we knew we were going to be in California for a couple of months. So we worked with someone there to line up a bunch of dance classes so Marley could learn from different instructors in person while we're there. Same with Sage, she'll look up like art classes or language classes and different language meetups in different cities so she could go there and connect with a person who might have an online course. But if not, the learning looks like being there with those people and practicing that thing that they're into.
Mm-hmm.
How much do I love the family freedom of schedule aspect of that life? Right? That is so incredible. Like I think back to studies and I think back to like our young adult unschooling study that I did with Peter and like the unschooling child study, family study. And like everyone was like, the best part of unschooling is the family freedom of schedule. That's amazing.
For us, we just started out going to Jamaica because that's home and it cost of living was a lot less when we started. And for some people, it's just within their city. I've interviewed folks where they're based in one city, but the work that they do, the communities that they're involved in, the types of work that they get to be involved in just allows for so much space and freedom and just emergent structure that shifts from time to time. And so that's something that I feel is really important for everyone to remember too, that it doesn't have to look like different countries. It can be also different experiences right where you are.
Early in the interview, you had said that you were kind of in kind of a schoolish mindset. Your daughters went to school, you thought in terms of academic stuff, and then slowly homeschooling and then moved away from a curriculum and stuff. So knowing what you know now as an unschooling parent, what would you say to the Akilah that was in that schooled mindset? If you could say anything, what kinds of things would you say to that?
First of all, calm down. Calm down. Like eye contact, calm down. That's the first and second things that I would say to her. Calm down. Because for me, it felt like we knew, Chris and I were really clear that they needed to not be in school for a while. We needed to listen to them. We needed to honor that they felt like they were in a freaking fire. Mm-hmm. And that was relevant. And that was the first thing. And so I was like, okay, great. That's done. So now what will learning look like? Okay, let's do these. I just jumped right into this other thing. And Marley and Sage are like, whoa. And I'm like, no, you whoa. Look, you have freedom. I have a book coming up and I tell the story in it about how Marley was like, I'm not taking my textbooks to the beach. And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, this is the best combination ever. We're going to read about seashells. And then you get to have actual seashells at the actual sea. And she's like, yeah, minus the textbook. And it took just them pushing for me to be like, fine, you don't need the textbook, for me to realize, oh my God, they don't need the textbook. So I would just say to that, Akilah, calm down and observe, pay attention, pay attention to them and busy yourself with research about how this works for people, as opposed to filling this void that isn't there when it comes to simulating learning environments for them, because you don't need to simulate a learning environment.